This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Welcome again to the Moral Imagination. Thank you for listening. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Bradley, and we're going to be talking about personalism as a response to over-criminalization in the United States. Dr. Bradley is a professor of religious studies at King's College in New York. He's also the director for the Center of the Study of Human Flourishing there. He is a Theologian-In-Residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Lincoln Square, and serves as a research fellow at the Acton Institute. His books include Liberating Black Theology, Black and Tired, The Political Economy of Liberation, Keep Your Head Up, Aliens in the Promised Land, John Rawls and Christian Social Engagement, Black Scholars in White Space, Something Seems Strange, Faith in Society, and Ending Over-Criminalization and Mass Incarceration, which we're going to talk about today. Anthony also has a new book coming out in the fall called Why Black Lives Matter. So Anthony and I are both actually fellows at the Acton Institute. I work at the Acton Institute. And so I've got to work with Anthony at conferences for the last 15 years or so. He has a wide background, as you can see. He's written on a number of things. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences from Clemson University, a Master's degree in Divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary, and a Master's of Arts in Ethics and Society from Fordham, and his Ph.D. is from Westminster Theological Seminary. Though Anthony and I both are fellows at the Acton Institute, and I work there, this is not an official podcast of the Acton Institute. The Moral Imagination is my own podcast, so the conversation here doesn't reflect the official views of Acton. But speaking of Acton, I want to let you know that there's actually a really good conference coming up where Anthony's going to be speaking. I'll be moderating a number of panels, and we're having a poverty summit on November 18th and 19th. It's called a Poverty Cure Summit. We're going to be having a lot of different discussions talking about everything from development, poverty in the developing world, entrepreneurial solutions to poverty. We'll have some debates over universal basic income. Dr. Brad Wilcox of the Institute for Family Studies will be there speaking on family. Noel Mehring on the sexual revolution and poverty in America. Kim Tan on entrepreneurial solutions to poverty, and a number of others. So I'll keep you updated on that. I don't think the website's up for that yet, but stay tuned and I'll give you some information on that. But you can look at acton.org for that conference. So again, my guest today is Dr. Anthony Bradley, and we're going to be talking about his book, Ending Over-Criminalization and Mass Incarceration. You can see information about Anthony's books and other things at the show notes at themoralimagination.com. And if you haven't given the podcast a rating yet, please do. Please share with your friends. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Anthony, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Anthony, I'd like to talk about your book on over-criminalization, but maybe let's just tell a little bit about yourself, some of the things you're working on, and how you got interested in these specific ideas.
Great. Yeah, I was particularly interested in some of the connections between youth incarceration and the family, and specifically kind of thinking about the ways in which breakdowns in the family sort of eventually lead to forms of criminal deviance. And I was in a class at Fordham University here in New York, and one of the psych professors was giving a unit on the juvenile system. And one of the things that was noted is that children that experience neglect and trauma, and in particular physical abuse and violence, right, and also sexual abuse, when they become adolescents, they tend to act out, right? Especially males, they tend to externalize their pain. And unfortunately, that acting out tends to be criminally deviant activity. And so in the juvenile system, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, I sort of was shaken by the idea that we're not really locking up, just sort of like bad kids, right? We're locking up hurt kids. Kids who've experienced a lot of pain and suffering, and they don't know how else to deal with that, right? They're sort of processing those things, and that lands them in the juvenile system. And that was the beginning of me that was the beginning of a long journey in trying to sort out the criminal justice system. And then I thought, well, then I wonder if that's also true in the adult system as well. And it turns out that it is, that adolescent contact with police is pretty predictive in terms of adult incarceration as well. So that really began me searching and sort of drew me into the issue. And I just started to read several books. And I came across Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is sort of the canonical text for those who are interested in this issue. And as she described it, something didn't really sit right with me in terms of the narrative that she was presenting. And that really started another rabbit trail that led to this book.
What specifically stood out to you as maybe a problem? What was it that stood out to you?
Well, I've always been suspicious of,
or maybe Anthony, sorry, I'm jumping in here. Why don't you give, for listeners, what's the 30-second summary of her book, The New Jim Crow, before we talk about what stood out to you? Sorry.
No, that's a great question. So it's sort of what's called now the standard story, as John Pfaff calls it at Fordham University Law School. It's the standard story is this, that mass incarceration, as we see it today, is a result of a racialized initiative by the criminal justice system to incarcerate African Americans. And if you look at primarily the war on drugs, that became the primary vehicle that drove incarceration rates up in the 70s and 80s and 90s as we use, in a very racialized way, police to control and incarcerate African Americans. And that didn't seem right to me because I didn't think, I'm always wary to attribute that level of planning and genius to the state. I'm always suspicious that politicians are smart enough to come up with a plan to use a system to sort of wage a race war using something like the police to do so. That just seemed to me a bit too charitable. So I just started asking questions because it just didn't seem right that they would come up with a plan like that and actually execute it, because as most of us are well aware, the government's really not successful at many of the things that they attempt to do at the state and local level. So as I began to dig more into the data, I saw that racialized narrative is actually inconsistent with what the data actually says. That in this country, what's actually true is not so much that we use the police and law enforcement to control African Americans and the drug war is the cause of that. That historically in this country, what we've done since the mid-18th century is to use the criminal justice, the state apparatus, specifically to control poor people. And so the poverty problem, sort of poverty class, that's actually the real mass incarceration over-criminalization story, not the racialized one. And what happened in the 1970s and 80s, as we focused the over-criminalizing and over-policing in poor communities, we specifically focused during the 70s and 80s and early 90s in low-income neighborhoods in inner cities. And that in part explains why we had those sorts of concentrations. But it was not because of the drug war, that in fact, primarily those incarceration rates were tied to property crime and violent crime, which had actually began to peak in the mid to late 1960s, which was technically before the quote-unquote war on drugs was launched.
So we've talked about this actually just when you and I were talking another time over the phone. So it goes to a point, maybe you could help clarify it. We were talking about poverty once broadly, and that I think you said it was maybe before the 60s and 70s. The focus on poverty was also rural poverty. So like a lot of kind of white rural poverty. What happened, and you can help explain this better than I can, but there was a shift to kind of the image of poverty as urban poverty. So maybe you could explain that. And then my question would be, so are you suggesting that what happened is because this is again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to re-articulate it, but since the 1800s, we've been using, or mid 1800s, we've been using policing to deal primarily with the problem of poverty. when the switch or focus on poverty went from either general and rural to specifically urban, there was more policing, and we'll talk about this, over-criminalization in those urban areas. And that led to a disproportionate number of, say, African Americans and Hispanics being imprisoned. But that the driving force of it wasn't necessarily racial, but poverty. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Right. When you look at the Dust Bowl days, those images of poverty associated with the Great Depression, you primarily see pictures of white people. If you look at any of the footage in terms of the news footage and news coverage of the Great Depression, those pictures are going to be primarily largely white people. There were pictures and images of poor Blacks and rural America in the South, but primarily that was rural. So after World War II, when you sort of had the emergence of the suburbs, plus you had these sort of large industrial cities that had become manufacturing bases, right? Pittsburgh, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, et cetera. And you had this great migration of African Americans from the South moving up to these northern cities for employment. In the 40s and 50s, the cities began to shift. Right? Primarily, those cities had been places where immigrants landed when they came over from Western Europe. New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, these were places where immigrants lived. In these cities, African Americans primarily were in the South. That began to shift in the 40s and the 50s. By the time we get to the 1960s, those urban centers that had Jewish immigrants from Western Europe, Polish immigrants, German immigrants, Italian immigrants, Greek immigrants were beginning to be replaced by African Americans moving up from the South. And by the time we get to the civil rights movement in particular, many of those communities in many of the large metropolitan cities across the country had completely flipped to being predominantly African American. And after World War II, those former immigrant communities that were in the cities were now moving out to the suburbs. And they took advantage of all of the programs that the government provided to sort of build the suburbs. And so that's when the sort of geographical, the kind of sort of spatial distinctions began to emerge. And so in order to sort of control this sort of new urban class from leaking into the suburbs, as you sort of move into the mid-60s through the 70s and 80s even, those who lived outside of cities were now making laws and rules for those that lived in the cities. Those who were judges and prosecutors and things like that were increasingly out in the suburbs. And so it was kind of the convergence of all sorts of variables that created this disaster where the cities became a focus of control because of violence, right? Because of unrest, because of quote unquote law and order. And there was an increasingly emerging emphasis in controlling and maintaining order in the cities. And it really raised the interest in sending police in as a means of control. And again, 60s, 70s, 80s, when you sort of look at it over a 20-year span, cities that sort of became primarily African American in terms of the ruling class were no less punitive than anywhere else, right? Which is one of the reasons the race narrative doesn't work. Like Washington, D.C. was not less punitive than anywhere else because the Black middle class also wanted the cities to be controlled and safe places. The only difference is that the Black middle class wanted increases in social services where that wasn't the case in other cities where kind of the white ruling class were making some of those rules. So that's kind of the larger context in terms of how the over-policing focus on urban centers went from, sort of white to Black. I mean, there are actually parts of Chicago, for example, that have been over-policed since before Prohibition, right? And it's just what's happened is a different community of people are living in the exact same neighborhoods that have been characterized and categorized as always being problematic.
Oh, it's okay. It's very interesting. So let me try to get to a couple of things because I want to go into your argument. So you're making the case, if I understand it, that there is a serious problem with over-criminalization, with over-policing. Okay, I want to talk about all that. But the first part of your argument in response to the new Jim Crow book is that, I think you're saying, I don't think the race alone describes the problem. And if we focus on the race problem alone, we're going to miss the actual problem and diagnosis of the problem. Is that partially your motivation there? And we can talk about what that is, but am I understanding you?
Yes, that if we diagnose the problem wrong, right? If we focus on race, and we're gonna end up with ineffective solutions. And the other part of that narrative, in terms of why the new Jim Crow story doesn't quite fit the data, is that Michelle Alexander focused on the federal system, and she didn't focus on the state system. And almost 90% of all prisoners are in state prisons, not federal prisons. And so when you look at mass incarceration or overcriminalization, it's just not a national problem, right? These are state problems. They're local problems, right? We don't have a criminal justice system. We have, 50 statewide criminal justice systems. And then if you break it down locally, counting things like that, right? We've got something like 3,000 different criminal justice systems, plural. And so what happens at the federal level never tells the story, because those federal laws don't always capture who's being arrested and who's not being arrested. So focusing on race really gets us in trouble, but then also focusing just on federal law and federal incarceration obscures the actual story, which is the story that is particularly identified with respect to issues in your particular state, right? So that's what matters is why are people being arrested in your state, not why are people being arrested in America, right?
Right.
So
right.
if we get those wrong, right, we focus on the wrong things, we're actually going to create those solutions that actually do not address the problem, and then we're kind of playing in the sandbox rather than creating effective solutions that bring real change.
Okay, well, let's talk about then the problem. I mean, one of the things we do see, and you write about this in your book, is that as a percentage of the population, African Americans and Hispanics are a higher number of incarcerations, right? So you're not denying that that's not part of the problem, but you're saying that if you think about it simply on a race model and you only look at the federal statistics, then it doesn't give you a bigger picture. So, and again, correct me if I'm just trying to make sure I get it, but I'd like you now, let's move to the key of your argument, because I think a lot of people, they may not think that we have a problem with overcriminalization, right? This seems to be kind of bipartisan, like we need to be tough on crime and all this stuff. But you're saying, no, we have serious problems with not just too much incarceration, but overcriminalization. And you go through it. I want to talk to you about the juvenile and adult, but maybe you could just go through the big picture themes of your book, and what you're concerned about and what you think the problem is.
Yeah. So the big picture theme is basically that we hold poor people in contempt in this country, and we don't really see them as persons. And that's a sort of old historical American narrative, is that we don't consider poor people persons. And that what we actually need to do if we want to introduce solutions to this is begin to see poor people, regardless of their race, as fully human and deserving of certain, not just rights, but certain treatment. Because they are actually human, and so because this is about the human person and not really about about ideology and laws, we need to be careful as a society in terms of how we treat persons, how we treat the human person. And we need to think very clearly about what we are doing to human persons and their families when we use the criminal justice system to control and manage poor people, rather than using all of the resources that we have in civil society that actually have successfully been proven to help keep communities safe and make contributions to human flourishing. That instead of using civil society institutions, we've resorted to, I think, out of laziness, to using the police. And that approach has been incredibly unsuccessful. And so using punitive measures as a way to encourage or discourage virtuous behavior is a train headed to a disaster. And that's why we see in this country that we are the sort of most incarcerated nation in the developed world. Right?
I mean, don't you write that the United States has 22% of the world prison population? Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I always make a caveat, because that's only because we live in a society with a constitution, right, and a government. Because people often say, well, the U.S. is more punitive than everybody else. I'm like, well, yes and no. We have people in prison, but in other countries they just kill people.
Right. Important to remember that. Yep. Of course.
Yeah, it's important to remember that there are other regimes. They don't have a criminal justice system. The justice is whatever happens on the street when officials just come in and kidnap and murder people, right?
Right. Yep.
So it's not that we're worse than other nations. It's that we, as a civilized society, have chosen to actually have a system rather than simply having the abuse of human rights be the norm. So in the sort of developed world, Americans tend to lean on punitive measures as a way to correct and manage those who break the social contract. And that's something that, was started by the Quakers, right? So our penitentiary system emerged in Pennsylvania. And part of the philosophy was to sort of remove people from the community, to hold them so they could repent and reflect, and then reinstate them back into community. And what happened over time is that as we disassociated the sort of religious frameworks from the penitentiary system, we simply relied on incapacitation alone, and thinking that that was going to be enough of a deterrent. And that was a failure as well.
I think I told you one of the things I really liked about your book is how you start with this framework of personalism and civil society, and that we have depersonalized poor people. We treat them like objects, and then we try to solve this problem through social engineering. And I think as you and I have talked about over the years, this is, I think, a fundamental problem. It's one of the social crises of, I think, modernity, is the objectification of persons, turning persons into things or to pure matter. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on that connection between personalism and civil society, to the big themes, and then we'll move into some specifics. But I really liked, I think that as I started your book, I was taken by that approach. I thought it was insightful, but I think also very unique, because you're looking at a problem that goes beyond, say, race, ideology, or law, and you're going to a core anthropological insight of what does it mean to be a person, and how should persons, poor persons and criminals, be treated.
Yeah, so personalism is this idea, right, that persons are not economic ends, right? They're not political ends. They're not individuals, right? They are living centers of free action, and they are beautiful splendors, right, of potentials of virtue and greatness. That's what a human person is. And they have all of these sort of wonderful characteristics and potentialities. And so regardless of whether or not you're wealthy or poor, if you're a person, you still have all of those attributes. And so personalism wants to ask this question: if we believe that people have these attributes of what it means to be human, what's it look like to structure society from the person up, rather than thinking about society from the ideology down, right? So we want to do what's best, what's more effective, what's right, even given the fact that we are not simply individuals, that we are persons.
So Anthony, let's pause you for just a second. I follow you because, I'm in the personalist camp here. But let's make a distinction. I think a lot of people would say, like, wait, what do you mean we're not individuals? And some people would hear you and think, oh, he's just promoting individualism. And then all of a sudden you stop and say, no, we're not just individuals, we're persons. Maybe make a little bit of distinctions, like what you mean and what does it mean to build something from the person up as opposed to, say, from the individual up or from the ideology down. If you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's important to and this is really something derived from Christian anthropology, that as human beings, as persons made in the image of God, that we have certain attributes that mirror the character and nature of God Himself, and that those attributes and characteristics mean that we are actually interconnected, and that because we are born into families, right, we're born into community, that we were born to be, as human persons, reflecting all of these attributes of God. We were born to be interdependent and connected with other people. And the nature of the family itself, that first community, is the community from which a person comes to know his or her own self. That you don't know who you are outside of the interconnectedness of a family. This idea that I'm an individual, that I'm sort of independent from other human connections, is a fallacy. It's actually impossible. Your and my sense of self is directly derived from that first community. And so because community and connection and mutuality and relationship is so important to even understanding who you are as a human, right? That when we remove someone from community, from connection, right, that we're actually having an impact on their sense of being fully human. That being human, by definition, demands connection to other humans. And so the criminal justice system, and this is why I think it's important to err on the side of making sure everything is absolutely right and fair and just, that the criminal justice system must take human personhood into consideration, because if you are removing someone from connection, from community, from family, from neighborhood, right, from society, and you're going to put them away somewhere else, that you are having an effect on their sense of being and their sense of meaning and the overall narratives from which we understand what it means to be ourselves. We are not individuals. We are definitionally interdependent and connected to other people, born out of a woman into a community. And human existence and thriving cannot happen without these interdependent relationships.
I think this is something, well, how that you and I agree on this very much. And I think I like that explanation. I sometimes quote the late Jesuit philosopher who's at Fordham, Norris Clark, who says in a very philosophical way, we are substance-in-relationship, so that we're neither simply existing for the collective, nor are we simply radical individuals, but we are human persons, subjects, willed for our own sake, to use a theological phrase, but we are also deeply involved. We have a social nature and we're born into family. So And I think, I mean, you can comment on this, but this seems to be like a fundamental problem because, I worked with the documentary film Poverty, Inc. and Poverty Cure. And that's actually one of the themes of, I think, the problems, the way we treat poor people in the developing world as well. We treat them as objects. You said this line, we try to control and manage poor people. It's like, I think this error on the nature of the person, this anthropological error, which is pervasive, is one of the driving forces of social engineering broadly, whether it's the surveillance state, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's how we deal with poverty or technological views. I mean, I think that this anthropological problem is a manifestation of social engineering, and the criminal justice system is one of the worst examples of that. How would you react to that?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So there's a great book called The Jail, written by Robert Irwin. This came out in 1981 or 87, and he noted that he sort of coined this term as it relates to criminal justice. He didn't coin the term, but he associated the term rabble with those that we throw in jail. And these are people of disrepute, right? These are the people that you don't want your children to marry, right? I mean, these are the people that you don't want in your house. These are the people you want out of your community, the rabble, right? These are the ones that we hold in contempt. And because in this country, we oddly associate poverty with immorality, we often think people are poor because they are lazy or because they are immoral, they are licentious, they are debaucherous people. We have a framing that says those people don't deserve to be treated well. And so as long as we label poor people like rabble or, thugs or rednecks or white trash or Hoosiers or whatever sort of label we want to put on people that we think are rabble and should be discarded, we dehumanize them, right? And as soon as we give them a new label, because they're no longer human, they're the rabble, then our conscience is clear in terms of how we use the criminal justice system to manage them. Because they're not people, they're rabble, right? They're not people, they're thugs. They're not people, they're rednecks. And so when we put the other label onto them, then we use the system in a completely different way. Then we expect the system to be used for us.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So when we call them, quote, like the poor, right? Whenever we other people and place them in a lower class of being, what happens, and this is also true, right? This is the history of eugenics as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Whenever we identify people as less than human by all sorts of labels, then we easily justify using various means of the state to violate their humanity and their sort of classic human rights and their dignity. And so This is why people don't think in many cases that we over-police certain communities or that we're being overly punitive, because it's those people, right? It's those thugs. It's those, as Hillary Clinton said in the 90s, right? Those super predators, right? It's those people. And this is why in the 1990s, by the way, Democrats and Republicans were equally, right, tough on crime. Because, and if you listen to some of Biden's speeches in the 1990s, as he was really pushing tough on crime laws, you will see the reclassification of people directly in the rhetoric of politicians. And what we did is we took that relabeling, internalized it, and then we stopped caring about how the system treats those who are truly disadvantaged.
Well, I think it's interesting because, and we'll go into this in just a second, like, you're not saying that violent criminals shouldn't be in prison. You're not saying there's not a place for prison. But I think what's so interesting about the way you think about it is that if we think about criminal justice and the prison systems by turning, first of all, poor people and then prisoners further into even a further dehumanized state, it deeply distorts the way we think about justice, because now those others, people, well, they're not like us. They're not deserving of the same human treatment. And so even if there's not an intentional kind of objectification, what happens is it seeps down into the way we think about criminal justice and other things. And so that we treat that the system is first broken because our anthropology is broken. And if we're going to actually reform the system, and we're going to talk about some of the things in a minute that you actually address, but the big picture is we have to rehumanize first the poor, if you want to put it in temporal orders, right? I don't mean first necessarily, but you know what I mean? Poor, number one. And number two, rehumanize people who are in prison, because they are persons too. And let me just throw one thing out, and then you can push back or agree or disagree. But one of the things that really strikes me on the dehumanization of prisoners that you write about in your book, and we can talk about in detail, is felons, right? Once you have a felony, you got a felony. And after you've paid your debt to society and spent 15 years in prison, you still have a felony. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to get loans. It's hard to do all these various different things. So it's really hard to get back into society, because in a sense, the felon is also another example maybe of the other. I mean, do you think that's correct, that the felon has also been categorized as a different kind of person? What do you think?
Yeah, we relabel them, right? A prior term was ex-con. And what's interesting is that when people get labeled that way and they're actually blocked from re-engaging their citizen participation in communities and blocked from making contributions to the common good, then we get surprised for some reason when they recidivate and end up committing crimes again and get rearrested, right? I mean, part of the goal of punishment, and this really comes more from the Christian tradition, is not to punish to incapacitate, right? But to punish for the purpose of being reconstituted back in the community. And for some reason in this country, and I think it's in part because of the labeling, we simply want to incapacitate and keep people right outside the city gates, right? To why? To protect our kids, our families, our communities from those people. And the Bible is replete with parables where Jesus comes specifically to interrupt that really natural human tendency to not want the other close to their communities. And so it's a massive problem that I think is driving how we not only use police, but also it drives what we categorize as criminal and how we enforce those crimes, right? So classic example is the distinction between being arrested for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine in the 1980s and 90s, right? If you were a wealthy lawyer and you got arrested for having a small amount of cocaine, your sentence was significantly less than if you were caught with a small amount of crack cocaine in some inner city. So the laws that we have are even written in a way to focus on the perceived anthropology of the other. And that contributed in many ways to the radical inflation in the numbers of people that we incarcerate. One of the things that I think it's important for people to remember, think about in this country, that we are sort of like incarceration nation, but even more importantly than that, we are the over-criminalized nation. Like, we make everything illegal,
right?
We just, if we think something needs to be changed, make it a law and make it illegal and make it punitive. So there's like about 45,000 laws in the Federal Penal Code. And the fact of the matter is, every single person in this country is a criminal. Everybody's a criminal. Every state has laws that we break every single day. In Pennsylvania, it's illegal to have your outlets, right, being outside of a particular distance, it's illegal to not have a bathroom close to proximity to bedrooms, right? So we have all these laws. I mean, it's illegal to skateboard in front of some of the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. And so the question is, why do some of us, because we're all lawbreakers, right? Why do some of us end up incarcerated for breaking all of the laws that we have in this country, and others of us do not, because we're all basically criminals? And so that's something that to consider in terms of how we label people. We don't see ourselves as criminals. We see those other people as criminals. Now, in fairness, and this is especially true as people think about drug laws. I mean, people often think, well, if we just legalize drugs, and then that would really reduce these numbers, and that's actually not true. Drugs account in most states only account for about 17 to 20% of those incarceration numbers. It only accounted for 22% of incarceration rate growth from the 70s to the 90s. Most people who are arrested for drugs don't spend more than 3 years incarcerated. So that's not the number. The real number is property crime and violent crime. And the other thing that we have to address in this country is that we have a violence problem. And that really led me to kind of think earlier about your prior question, is why are we so violent? And how do we stop violence? And what are the things that really undermines violence? And that's what really is the advantage of thinking about personalism as a solution in terms of how we label people and seek to work with them.
So let's do this. I'd like to go back to that because I want to talk about solutions a little bit towards the end. But let's I think pause for a second and let me ask just a couple of quick questions. I mean, one, somebody listening might say, "Well, what does Anthony think nobody should be in prison?" What do you say to that?
Absolutely. I think we have all sorts of good reasons to incarcerate people when they break the social contract. I think you're right, naturally, right? There are people who commit all sorts of violent crimes that need to be incarcerated for various reasons, right? But we have to we actually need to think more critically about those situations that require incarceration and those that do not. And that's where we haven't done a really good job of making those very, very clear distinctions, right? And we haven't looked at the role of prosecutors in this. And we also haven't looked at the role of civil society institutions in terms of their role in keeping communities safe, but also their role in serving as alternatives to incarceration. And
well, you gave that example. I mean, I think at the end, when you said, for example, let's say somebody vandalizes a store, especially if it's a young person, but even if it's not a young person. But you gave the example of a young person. They vandalize a store, and you said, okay, so you get them in a room with this was the example you gave, a young person with their parents, with a police officer, with the owner of the store, and say, okay, you've vandalized the store. You're going to have to pay for it. And you're going to have to work cleaning windows and et cetera, et cetera. And this teaches consequences. It teaches respect for property. It shows that there's a cost to vandalism. But you don't have to put this young person into a prison system from which he may never escape.
Right. And as soon as you put a young person in a U.S. prison system in any state, they come out worse. The system itself, the experience itself, criminalizes people. It's not a place that cultivates virtue at all. And so if we're going to put a human person, in a system like that, and we know the data is pretty clear that it actually criminalizes people and turns them into people that tend to practice more criminal deviance once they are released, do we want to do that? I think it's also important to consider what we're doing when we remove, say, a father from his community,
right,
or a mother from her community, right? So if this person,
there's a huge cost to that. I don't just mean monetary, but I mean there's a cost. You remove a mother or a father for something. Now and of course sometimes we've already said there's like violent crime, abuse, some people need to be incarcerated. But sometimes people get removed for things that they're not really a major danger to society. And then you actually create a bigger problem by removing them. I jumped in there, but I read your book. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, we talk about the importance of the family, the importance of fathers. And when you lock up a father, we can't be surprised at the negative externalities that happen with his family 10 years later when his kids are teenagers, right? Mm-hmm. And so here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that if the father commits a crime, he doesn't need to be punished.
Right.
Right? What I'm saying is, if he commits a crime, does he need to be incarcerated for that long? And is incarceration the only solution to having this person pay restitution to the community, or sort of right, kind of pay their dues, right? You sort of, do the crime, do the time. Well, does that time have to be in a prison cell in the totality? Or, for example, can part of that time be in a cell and then the other part of that time be working for a community service organization or a church where the person is actually receiving not just punitive contact, but also moral formation, right? Also sort of spiritual formation, also emotional support, because we're trying to, right? We want to rehumanize people that have been dehumanized. Because when people experience what it means to be truly human, then that's actually how they act. They act like humans. When people don't think they're truly human, they won't act like humans. So we want people to feel and believe that they are truly human, and then have them participate in society so that they can make contributions to the common good. So I'm not saying we should not have prison or incarcerate, but we want to be incredibly careful about how we do it and how long we do it and what that process actually looks like. And that's why using the human person and the attributes of what it means to be human as a starting point helps us rethink, I believe, how we develop and decide what's illegal, how we decide to punish what's illegal, what happens during the incarceration process, and what reentry must entail as well.
Right. So, I think it's 3 or 4 ways we can go here. But one thing I think struck me that goes back to something with juvenile crime and recidivism, where 70 to 80% of students will be rearrested within 2 and 3 years of release. Now, this is important. The next thing you write is really important. Only 12% of juvenile criminals are incarcerated for violent crimes, while the majority are punished for minor offenses, right? And they lose all of these social opportunities, plus, of course, you say debilitating psychological trauma. And of course, for girls, in some ways, there are obviously more boys who are being imprisoned, but for girls, it's even many worse. They have worse psychological problems. They often there's sexual abuse. Sometimes they've already been victims of human trafficking. And so I think sometimes there's an image. You've talked about this before. You can help me get this right, because I think it's hard to get it right. In one sense, a lot of people who are in prison are there for violent offenses, right? But when you look at the juvenile system, people are going to prison for nonviolent offenses, which puts them on a track. The data is quite clear that puts them on a track to more likely be adult offenders. Let me throw out a couple things, Serge. I think it'd be nice to talk about the problems with the juvenile system. You mentioned this in your book. I don't think people realize this, that truancy can be criminalized. You can get arrested for skipping school. You can get arrested in some schools for talking back to the teacher. I know that's obviously extreme, but nevertheless, you write about these examples where, a food fight in say a upper middle class high school would be teenagers having fun and being stupid, right? Misbehaving. Okay. Don't do that. You pay a little bit of a price, you're good. But in some poor places, you can actually end up in prison for that. Can you talk about that? Am I wrong? Or
No,
Explain.
you're exactly right. There's a Latin phrase, locus parentis, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that is the framework for the criminal justice system. That Latin phrase means an absence of the parents, or rather, in place of the parents. So when the juvenile system was created in the late 19th century, particularly to deal with kind of really bad and rambunctious orphans running around cities, I think it actually started in Chicago. I think that was the very first juvenile court. We have replaced, in many cases, right, the role of the father with police and the juvenile system. And so what we've done is the sorts of things that parents punish kids for actually doing normally adolescent, pre-adolescent things, right? We make them illegal, and then we lock them up. And when we put them in the criminal justice system as juveniles, right? The intake process itself, being stripped naked, wearing orange jumper, in many cases being thrown in, they're being held, being thrown in with adult offenders in some cases, like the whole process being thrown in, kind of a Lord of the Flies situation with a range of teenage offenders, it actually changes them. And so we got to be careful, because there was actually just a case recently, I think it was in Detroit, where a judge sent a girl to juvenile detention because she did not do her homework in quote unquote violation of her parole. Why would you throw a child in jail as a parole violation measure because they knew their homework? There was an incident in Baltimore recently where a 14-year-old boy was arrested for stealing milk from the cafeteria. Now, 14-year-old boy stealing things in school is as old as schools have existed, right? And instead of the school handling it in-house, or, when I was growing up, you would get your ear pinched by the teacher, Mrs. Robinson, whenever the boys were did something bad. She had these fingernails that were as long as the George Washington Bridge, and they would extend across the ring. You get a pinch on your arm or pinch in your ear as a corrective. Today, because of the presence of police in schools, the things that I did that got me in trouble in elementary school and middle school would get me thrown in jail now in this country. And so
now, sorry, people would say, I want to push this for a second, because people would say, oh, come on, Anthony. I mean, you're just exaggerating, one or two cases. But you're making the case, this is not one or two cases. And this goes back to your earlier framework. If you look at it and as in poor communities, as opposed to, say, middle class or upper class communities, it's a very different situation. So those of us who don't live in poor communities, we're blind to this. We just don't. It's almost beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, and just think about what we've done, right? Where are the police? In most inner cities, the police are actually in the school, right? School resource officers are what they're often called. And so school resource officers, again, as sort of locus parentis, are there in the building, not to keep the building or the school safe from outsiders. Like that's what you get in a wealthier suburb, right? The police are there to keep the school shooter from coming in and shooting the students. In low-income areas, particularly in inner cities, police officers with guns and tasers are literally inside a building full of children to handle classroom management issues, kids being disrespectful, kids fighting, and things like that. So guess what? Police officers are trained to do what police officers are trained to do, right? Enforce the law. The fact that the law is broken inside a building full of children to the police officer is completely irrelevant. And so the police officer is going to do exactly what he or she was trained to do and enforce the law when breaking the law is presented to them. So when you have the police actually there, physically present in a building full of children, then you're going to get police use as not the last resort, but the first resort. And as soon as police are used as a first resort, children are taken into the hands of the incarceration state, the criminal justice system, rather than with parents and school administrators. It actually subverts and undermines the role that parents and school administrators play in managing some of these situations.
And I can imagine they get worse because it creates all sorts of sociological externalities. We could talk a lot about the juvenile system, and I think it's really important. So I encourage listeners, buy Anthony's book, read. He has a whole chapter section on juvenile issues in criminal justice system. Let's talk about a couple of other problems. Maybe we can go kind of reasonably quickly through some of these problems.
Sure.
But another problem that you address is the problem with plea bargaining. What happens is, and you can explain this, that people end up, even if they're not guilty, they say, look, the chance of me getting convicted for something I may not be guilty of, I'll just bargain for a lower sentence so I'm not as in trouble. The problem is they cannot, explain this to me, did I understand this correctly? When that takes place, there's no ability for them to be acquitted at that point, right? Because they cannot give up their jury. Can you explain the problem with plea bargaining?
Yeah, most cases are adjudicated outside of the courtroom. And in most states, it's in the mid to low 90s in terms of percentile of the number of cases that are cleared through the actual court system. Usually what happens is that the prosecutor and the defense attorney work out a way to draw it to a conclusion. That's the majority, the large majority, like almost all criminal cases are handled that way. What happens in a lot of low-income communities is that prosecutors do what's sort of called kind of stacking charges, right? Because they have an arsenal, volumes and volumes of potential laws, prosecutors just roll out a menu of all the things that they can charge you with. And if you are an upper income person, you just get an attorney and your attorney just completely ignores and rejects these charges as frivolous. But if you're lower income and you're working with a public defender for whom you're just sort of case number 172B, you don't have the same level of scrutiny on your defense. And so the prosecutor tells you, hey, these are the 12 things that you can get charged for. And because of this act that we arrested you for, we could send you to prison for, 20 to all these charges. If you're found guilty, we'll send you to prison for 20 to 30 years. However, if you plead guilty to this one, 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years, and the person says, I could either get 30 years or I could serve for 3. And they say, well, I'll just choose 3. And they plead guilty to whatever the prosecutor put before them that had that lower sentence. And the fact is, had their case actually gone to court, likelihood of them being acquitted of most of those charges would have happened. And in many cases, the evidence wasn't even strong enough to render a guilty plea on the thing that they were arrested for in the first place. And so the due process that's guaranteed in the Constitution is subverted because prosecutors plead out cases with defense attorneys without the presence of a judge.
And this happens, your argument, more among poor people than among people of means.
Absolutely, because there are incentives in the criminal justice system for police departments and for prosecutors to clear as many cases per day as they can. So they just kind of want to get through the cases as they can. And these public defenders, overworked, underpaid, under-resourced, right? They don't have the arsenal of weapons to fight a prosecutor. But if you're middle class and up, you do, right? You get a defense attorney, and the defense attorney basically keeps the prosecutor accountable. In low-income communities, the prosecutor has absolutely zero accountability, and they're essentially doing whatever is in their best interest as a prosecutor, right? It's in the prosecutor's best interest for you to plead guilty to something rather than you experiencing due process, as the Constitution guarantees, in a court of law to determine if the evidence actually proves that you committed the crime or not if you plead not guilty. That just doesn't happen. So we have this idea, I think, from watching television shows like Law and Order, that's what happens every day, but that's not what happens every day. What happens every day is that, John gets arrested. He sits in an office with police, defense attorney, prosecutor, and everything is handled right there, and it never, ever, ever goes to court. That's normally how the criminal justice decisions are made. It's the prosecutor, not the judge.
And you said that's up to over 90%?
Over 90%. Some 94, 96% of cases, depending on your state.
And then they're sentenced later by the judge.
Well,
how does sentencing take place?
Yeah, so sentencing is according to state law, right? This is why these are state issues, not federal issues, right? The state legislature actually determines the sentencing laws. Judges simply rule on the cases, but the details of any particular sentence that's issued is determined by the state legislature. So the sentence is what it is. And so you plead guilty to X, Y, or Z. Whatever the state says the sentence is, it is what it is. In some cases, there are going to be maximums or minimums. And depending on particular context, those maximum or minimums are often negotiated after a plea is rendered.
So it's in a sense, you lose the sense of justice in the justice system, meaning Anthony does X or not does X, plea bargains, whatever it is, and there's no justice. Like, well, these are the conditions, this was the situation, this is the background. It's just kind of like you're put into a machine, like, you did X 3 years, you did X 10 years, whatever.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to remember that, since the 1980s, what's escalated in a lot of states is minimum sentencing, right? So
that's kind of part of the tough on crime, right?
It is, right? 3 strikes, you're out. In California, for example, whatever the third offense was, you would get the maximum sentence no matter what the crime was, the maximum no matter what, right? So
it's okay. So give, for example, you do a smaller crime.
Yeah.
But if it's your third offense, you get what, a certain amount of time?
Yeah, you get the maximum that the law says you should get for that crime. So let's say if a particular crime in the law says you might get 10 to 15 years, you commit that crime, third offense, you get 15. Right. So you get the maximum, right?
So you're a kid, you do something stupid, you steal something, okay. Then you do something else. And I'm saying nonviolent, but the third offense, even if it's nonviolent, you could still get 10 years prison.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. And this is why people do sometimes end up incarcerated for long periods of time for drug-related offenses, because it might be their third offense from something. They might have had 2 petty offenses, and then the third offense is a drug offense, and they get a maximum. Right, because it's the third offense, right? And
it does. I assume it doesn't start over like when you're 18.
No,
right. So if you do something stupid at 16, you're already one down.
Yeah. And again, those are negotiated within particular states in terms of which one of those offenses, right, is sort of on your ledger that counts toward the overall count. Now, I think, again, what really matters in this discussion is the issue of violence. And because that's the main driver and sustainer of our criminal justice system.
Right.
We have a violence problem in this country. And part of the personalist approach is thinking about ways to interrupt and undermine violence.
Mm-hmm. Let's pause on that for just a second. I want to ask you a couple more questions because I want to go back to that, because I think there's a couple. I want to, as we get to the end here, which is pretty soon, I want to go back to the violence question because I have some questions about that. But I think a couple of other things that you wrote in your book that are interesting to note. You mentioned the Fifth Amendment, right? The kind of double jeopardy, and that there's ways to skirt around that, which also is a problem of justice. Can you just give a quick summary of that problem?
Well, I think what happens, again, with really overly zealous prosecutors is that when you have this massive arsenal of laws at your disposal, and again, thousands of them, right? I can be charged with A and be acquitted, and then technically I committed B, C, D, and E. You can charge me with B as well. But because I was acquitted on A, you can still charge me with B. And then we're back at square one. So again, the way charges work and the way laws work, prosecutors have such a large menu of options of things to charge you with that it, in one case, doesn't matter what the charge is, because they can always find something else to charge you with, because everybody's always breaking some kind of law all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And this is, by the way, this is exactly how we were able to get during Prohibition, right? So many mobsters were sent to prison, not for murder, right? Not for being caught with contraband, right? What was often charged? Tax evasion. Tax evasion, right? So they couldn't get them on the murders. They couldn't get them on the contraband, but they got them on the tax evasion. And that's how we use the system. We find a reason to arrest people that we want in jail. We find a way to do it because there's always a law that somebody's broken.
So let's go maybe into then bigger, as we kind of come to the end here. I'm really grateful for your time. Let's talk about some kind of bigger social questions. And one of them is, you've talked about it a little bit, but why do you think, what's going on in society that there's a general agreement? People don't tend to like it. They kind of complain about it, but both parties kind of move it forward. What's this obsession almost with over-criminalization? Like, why is everything illegal? You know, I actually had on the podcast the farmer Joel Salatin, and he talks about, he's an organic farmer in Virginia, and he actually wrote a book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. And it's about like just trying to be a farmer. And you gave the examples of like plugs and everything. And he said, you know, I want to do this, I can't, it's illegal. I want to do this, I can't do it illegal. So in a sense, this question is not simply about the criminal justice system. It's broadly, what is it about American society today, do you think, that makes us so zealous to make absolutely everything a law?
Well, one of the things that I think is pretty pervasive is that when you have a culture that doesn't have any sort of moral or virtue norms to insert as a way to motivate and direct our behavior and to justify it, you're just left with power, right? So if virtue doesn't provide the incentive, if morality doesn't provide the center, then you just have power. You just have law. Right. You just have the state. Right. And by the way, there's absolutely, it should not be surprising to people that the states that are the most secular historically are also the ones that are the most punitive and violent when it comes to the state. And so what happened in America? There's a direct correlation between the ways in which we sort of purge morality and calling people to morality and virtue from public life, and then resorting to punitive measures in the criminal justice system to provide incentives and disincentives for people to participate and not participate in certain behaviors.
No, it's kind of amazing. I mean, think about it, just like to push this. You can't say certain things in schools, especially in public schools, government schools, about morality, about virtue, about certain ways of living. Otherwise, you're imposing your views or whatever it might be. But you can arrest children, right? I mean, am I missing something? Right. I mean, I know I'm being slightly provocative, but I don't think it's wrong. It's like, no, you're not allowed to teach that because, we live in the dictatorship of relativism. Right. But we got to solve the problem. So we're going to arrest children.
Yeah. You can't say that X or Y is wrong. So we'll have to make it illegal.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right.
Right.
I mean, I think that's actually a problem of like morality and legality anyway. I think that in the past, you would have, and I don't just mean the past, it's not that the past is always good. I mean, the past has problems too, but there was a sense, I think, very much in Western law that not everything that's immoral is illegal, but things that are immoral are discouraged, right? And you don't need the power of the state to regulate everything, right? So, for example, you wouldn't need laws against children fighting in school because the schools would handle it. But as we lose a sense of morality, then it's either legal or not legal. And so there's no space for something being immoral, but not illegal.
Absolutely. And with our children, this is why this is so egregious. With our children, by just locking them up first, we lose the opportunity for moral and virtue formation. Because a child is going to make mistakes and do wrong things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so when we just throw them in the juvenile system, we actually lose the opportunity to have their conscience be shaped by what happens when morality situates their act as it relates to the common good and to
their family,
right? And a community.
Yeah.
Right. And even this is really, and this will be my last point on this. I think it's even more terrible because I think in some respects, and this is a kind of dehumanizing othering, we think people are too stupid to exercise and be called to virtue and wisdom. So that won't work. So we assume. So we'll just lock them up instead.
Yeah.
We're not going to have them appeal to virtue or appeal to morality or appeal to what's embedded in their nature. We're just going to lock them up.
Right. Now, let me ask you on this question. I think some people would hear you. There's two interesting things going on. It's just maybe a can of worms, but oh well. You made this point right now that the more secular a state is, the more you see kind of the violent acts of the state more putative. Now, how would you analyze this question? Maybe this is a whole other podcast, but you have kind of a progressive move to like decriminalize or to not punish. And then you've got a conservative move to, well, we need to be tough on crime. But that's not exactly only conservatives because a lot of progressives also want to be tough on crime. And it seems like everybody's cloudy on this and everybody's reaction. You and I were talking earlier. It just said one of, I think, the problems of our time is that what does my opponent think? Oh, he likes X? Okay, I don't like it. What does my opponent think? He doesn't like Y? Okay, I'm for Y. It's like there's just a high reactionary nature going on. But I think, how do you think clearly about this? Because I think people are really confused. People don't want to say, well, I'm not for this over-criminalization, but we have to keep violent criminals in prison and keep our streets safe. Yep. And then other people say, we have to just let people out and there's like everything's cloudy. What, you've studied this for a long time. What would you say, and this is a big question, I think you're following me, I hope. I don't know how coherent I was, but how do we think about this in a way that's clear, that doesn't fall prey to all the pitfalls of, say, contemporary right-left debate?
Yeah, I think, great question. I think really two things. One is that we need a philosophy of punishment. And that's where we're unclear. We need to know what we're going to punish and why and how. And that's a philosophical discussion that as local communities is not happening. Right. And so our philosophy of punishment, our philosophy of what we criminalize or not, like that, like we've got to actually get back to having that conversation rather than just every time we get mad, we create a new law. Right. And what we're doing is we're just locking up people we're mad at. And because we aren't thinking conceptually about the role of law and the role of punishment, it's sort of continued and gotten us into the mess that we're in. I think secondly, the other thing is that we are too reactionary and not preventative. And so we've got to start thinking about, instead of keeping our community safe on the back end from criminals, how do we stop people from becoming criminals in the first place?
Right.
Right. That's actually where the real work is, as we deal with people who are currently incarcerated, as we deal with people who are facing reentry, is that how do we on the front end keep people out of the system? And we have not done enough work and care and invested enough resource and imagination to thinking about what is it that keeps people from being criminally deviant in the first place and working hard on that. to make
Right.
the system. My dream is to make policing irrelevant, to make prisons irrelevant, but that only happens when people are not criminally deviant. And you just can't, sort of abolish policing and abolish prisons without focusing on the virtues and values that keep people from being criminally deviant in the first place. And I think those are the sorts of things, particularly that local churches and Christians really can make a massive contribution to upending this entire system in the first place, because the Christian tradition are actually experts at forming the values and virtues that keep people from being criminally deviant. And the more that we form those values and virtues that lead to flourishing and the common good, it actually makes the criminal justice system a less present and or necessary institution.
I think there's a couple of things that I thought of as you were talking. One is a very philosophical point, which I talk about a lot on this podcast, but is that we've lost a deep sense of what reason is. We've reduced reason to the empirical. I know you're a chemist, and so you like facts and data, but I know as a theologian and a philosopher, you also realize that reason cannot simply be reduced to the empirical. First of all, it's incoherent on its own terms. But second of all, it, I think, is a factor in this problem, because we can't talk about morality. We can't talk about justice. We reduce everything to power, lock up people that we're mad at. And then I think that relates to the second part of how we're going to reinvigorate civil society and churches and the moral order and a sense of virtue and desire for the good. Again, this is one of the reasons I think your book is so interesting. Our anthropology is broken. We have like a very desiccated, vitiated, dried up, broken anthropology that makes us into these kind of small automatons. And now we got to figure out how to deal with us. But if you have a broad anthropology and you take reason very seriously and you take the moral life and virtue seriously, not something to either make fun of or to think that it's somehow restricting your liberty to exercise your will, then I think these things become possible. Otherwise, I think the current context of the philosophical, anthropological context that dominates Western society today really creates massive obstacles for us to do the last thing you said. What do you think?
Absolutely. And we've been pragmatically just acting and not thinking. And because, thinking is not a part of the discourse anymore, power is, and having your political tribe win is, right? Because being right and winning the conversation, winning elections, winning political and social power matters more than reason, and coming to conclusions that really value the human person, we have the sorts of problems that we have, not just in the criminal justice system, but I think in multiple spaces across our society as well. And so I think we have an opportunity to really recapture some of those things so that we can bring effective solutions to these problems rather than doing the things that continue to not work. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to introduce this book the way that I did into the conversation.
Yeah, it's very good. So we got to finish here in a second. I'm grateful for your time, but there's one thing you've mentioned a couple times that I want to make sure I don't escape. There's two things. One is you talk about the family in the book a lot, and the importance of the family, the importance of fathers. I once had a conversation with several inner city Detroit pastors, all African American, and we were talking about different things. And they told me, most 13-year-old boys have never been hugged by their father. And I think the family, and you've talked about the problem of violence a lot. Can you, maybe we get towards the end here, talk just a little bit about how important is the family? It seems to be a neglected element because it feels judgmental to say that intact families are really important, especially for boys, and to reduce violence. Can you talk about those two things, and what do you think some of the problems, and how do we think about those?
Yeah, the psych data on that is really pretty clear that particularly for boys, the more time they spend with their dads, the more empathetic they are, and the more they are considerate of other people. The more affectionate that fathers are with their sons, with time spent, the more compassionate their sons will be as adults. And the data also shows that when boys experience sensory neglect, lack of hugs, lack of affection, also abuse, beatings, physical abuse, sexual abuse. That's a predictor of criminal deviance. And so making sure that the boys have love and affection and care with their parents and especially their father is the biggest crime prevention tool we have in our society. And a couple of really good studies were done at the end of the book that I mentioned. I'll just mention one of them. 2 juvenile cohorts who had really, really intense violence capacity, aggression capacity, were given 2 protocols. One was given a protocol of daily relaxation videos that you sort of see in the lobby of your dentist's office. You're watching fish and listening to classical music. The other, they were given back massages, like the kind that you get when you sit in the airport in a chair with your face down and they kind of run up and down your back. And so what they noted is that the group that were given the relaxation videos, their levels of aggression, deviance, uncooperation with adults didn't change. However, the group that was given the massages, their anxiety level went down, their depression level went down, their aggression went down, their cooperation with adults increased, and all of these other variables, their propensity to violence decrease, and all those other variables that sort of lead to criminal deviance dissipated. And the research shows that level of sort of physical intimacy, especially from the family and specifically from the father, is why typically some boys are turned into criminals and other boys do not. One of the things I tell audiences when I speak is that hurt boys hurt other people. They hurt us. And boys that receive a lot of help actually become helpers. And so the family is actually the most important institution in terms of dismantling the criminal justice system, and especially the affection and care and love of a father really does have a way of undermining and eliminating criminal deviance, because boys externalize their pain.
Sure.
So one of the brainstorms that I had for public schools, right, is that if a kid gets in trouble, breaks a rule, gets into a fight, the police shouldn't take the 2 boys to prison, to jail. They should take them to a physical therapist and let them get massages, right? And see what happens then.
Well, you actually make a point, like, that sounds kind of funny and everything, but you make a point that's related to anthropology, which is that we are embodied persons. Another massive error in modern secular anthropology is it disregards the body. It looks like it affirms the body because it's a materialist view, but it misses the fact that we are embodied persons, that we're in a very, you could say, Aristotelian hylomorphism, however you want to articulate it. We are ensouled organisms. We are embodied persons. And our hurt souls, our hurt hearts affect negatively in bodily manifestation. And abuse hurts us interiorly and psychologically. I'm speaking very simply, obviously, for this. I mean, we could talk about it in more philosophical language, but just to make it simple. And so too does positive touch. I actually thought you were going to say like they did jujitsu or something, where you're actually, very carefully working with somebody in a controlled area. But yeah, I think it's important. I mean, the facts are we're embodied persons. This goes back to your anthropological point. And I think the deep, deep confusion, and we're social persons and we're born into families, and families are not simply social constructs, made up by the state. So families are a natural, a biological, sociological, and personal reality.
Absolutely. And this is why I think that it's important, again, to humanize the people that we believe are criminally deviant, rabble and others, because the extent to which people who live in low-income communities experience love and care and affection is the extent to which they will not end up incarcerated. And that's an approach, because we're human persons, that I want to encourage people to think about as we imagine new solutions moving forward that allow us and activate us to use the things that we do best in our communities to help people end up in situations where they undermine their humanity, break social contract, but also undermine the flourishing of others. We can get this, I'm hopeful that we can really do a lot of good work if we focus on the preventative things that keep people from having that first contact with the criminal justice system and making things like locus parentis socially and culturally irrelevant.
Yeah. Anthony, thanks. This is great. I mean, so the name of your book is Ending Over-Criminalization and Mass Incarceration, Hope from Civil Society. I encourage everybody to read the book. It's excellent. And just follow Anthony on Twitter, follow him and his work. Anthony, you've got a number of books out, and you have a new book coming out. It's titled Why Black Lives Matter. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a personalist approach to thinking about some of the issues that make contributions to African American thriving in the 21st century.
And that's coming out when?
That's coming out in the fall of 2020. No specific release date yet, but sometime in the fall.
All right. Well, I'll put that on the website, the Moral Imagination podcast, and also this book and other books. Would you follow you on Twitter? Anything else? Anywhere else that people can find your work?
Yeah, just Twitter and Amazon. Those are probably the best places. I also do quite a bit of writing for the Acton Institute as well. People can find things that I write there.
Right. Good. Yes. I write there too. So, all right. Good. Anthony, thank you very much. Thanks so much for joining. I hope you'll come back to talk about your next book and have you back on. People listening may not know all the things that you know. I mean, Anthony, just a little bit of praise here at the end. Maybe I should do more of this at the beginning, but Anthony is a very serious theologian, a philosopher, a social philosopher. He's written a number of books on a lot of things. And so it's great to see how you take all that work and you integrate it in something like a criminal justice system. So Anthony, thanks again for joining the Moral Imagination podcast.
Thanks for having me.